Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the herb rosemary. Now, I've selected rosemary for special attention because of several articles that have crossed my radar, so to speak, but as just a very brief preface, I wanted to say two things. Firstly, there's going to be a number of different perspectives on the use of herbals and the use of different kinds of natural supplements for the purpose of Alzheimer's or other dementia care or just for general health. I'm not going to really get into those. My ambition is not to convince you of anything. It is simply to lay out or to disclose certain avenues that I find particularly interesting. Whether they pan out or not is anybody's guess. But in general, the three perspectives on herbals are essentially going to be something like this. The first perspective basically says you should have nothing to do with them. You should concentrate on pharmaceuticals, trust the traditionally trained physician who is essentially going to map you onto those medicinals, those drugs, those pharmaceuticals that have FDA approval, that have scientific studies behind them, and the like of that. Second perspective wants to have almost nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. That perspective is essentially going to be labeled the alternative medical or alternative therapeutic perspective, and for those individuals who are attracted to that perspective, they're not going to want to have general pharmaceutical drugs. They're going to want to go towards foods or herbs or something along the lines of that. And then there's kind of a composite strategy. We might call it a complementary approach, where a person might say, you know what, there may be some pharmaceutical drug that is advantageous, and there may also be an herb or some kind of a food supplement that might helpfully complement so that we can work together to try and improve general health or to treat a particular ailment, such as some kind of a cognitive deficit. Once again, I am not taking a position on any of these today, but those are the three general approaches. I am not a medical professional. I am not an herbalist. I am not a traditional doctor. I have no ability to give you medical advice, to diagnose conditions, to treat conditions. If you need specific recommendations, you need to consult with a licensed and competent professional in your area. You are free to take whatever perspective you want. Once again, this video is just for general informational or entertainment purposes only. A little bit of history here. I've gotten into other videos where I describe some of the possible causes for Alzheimer's disease. I'll put a link in the description. I won't get into those here, but suffice it to say that one of the perennial topics for possible causation in Alzheimer's disease is a deficiency in a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Now, acetylcholine is produced by the brain. It is a neurotransmitter produced by the brain. But the brain has a very interesting mechanism in place to try to make sure that too much of this and too little of this don't get produced. In other words, the brain has an interesting mechanism for trying to police the amount of neurotransmitters that it has, because essentially it is possible that it doesn't produce enough. It's possible that it produces too much. So for acetylcholine and choline, which is another neurotransmitter, another chemical, the brain also produces erasers, let me call them that, for these different chemicals. The erasers, called esterases, have the ability to go in and scrub or eliminate excess neurotransmitters. Now, when everything is functioning correctly, the brain then is able to maintain what it holds to be an optimal blend of neurotransmitters to help the brain perform at its peak. But when something goes awry, it's possible that the brain might have too little of something or too much of something else. Now, one of the early research avenues into Alzheimer's discerned a correlation between Alzheimer's and other dementias and a low amount of acetylcholine in the brain. Now, this suggested to researchers that one possible intervention that might help with Alzheimer's to treat it or to improve the condition is the ability to suppress those erasing chemicals that eliminate acetylcholine. The idea is that if a brain has too little acetylcholine, it might be because the cholinesterase, that is to say, the acetylcholine eliminating chemicals, might be working overboard and taking out too much of the acetylcholine. So there is a classification of pharmaceuticals called cholinesterase inhibitors, and that classification's job is essentially to suppress the erasing effect of this cholinesterase in the idea that it's going to try to raise the level of acetylcholine available in the brain. I know that's somewhat convoluted, it's somewhat confusing, but essentially several different pharmaceuticals have been brought to the market with that very idea in mind. One of the earliest was a drug called Tacrin, which was branded under the name Cognex. Now this drug is no longer available. I don't believe it is in circulation anymore, but it was designed as one of these cholinesterase inhibitors. Now in the present climate, one of the drugs that does this is donepezil, also known as Aricept. It's a very popular pharmaceutical to be prescribed for Alzheimer's and related conditions. And once again, functions as a cholinesterase inhibitor. Well, it turns out that several herbals are able to do something very similar to this according to some researchers. And one of those is rosemary. So rosemary contains a constellation of compounds and chemicals that some researchers believe have the ability to reduce the amount of cholinesterase and thereby increase the amount of acetylcholine in the brain. One of these researchers that if you Google this you will run across is Dr. James Duke. According to Dr. Duke, at least in some of the second and third hand sources that I was able to acquaint myself with, there are at least a dozen chemicals within rosemary that have the ability to perform this cholinesterase function. One of these is carnosic acid. Additionally, rosemary, being a natural herbal, has additional chemicals, some of which also will play into some researchers' suggestions for how Alzheimer's may be treated or even prevented. One of the common things now, besides the acetylcholine deficiency, to finger as a possible culprit for the onset of Alzheimer's is brain inflammation, particularly chronic inflammation. So it is not uncommon to see discussions of herbs like turmeric that have anti-inflammatory actions, and rosemary is one of these again. Supposedly rosemary has half a dozen different chemicals, including various COX2 or COX2 inhibitor enzymes that have the ability to function as anti-inflammatory agents. In addition to that, there is a classification of chemicals called huperzine A, which is also found in the herb club moss, and this once again is sometimes prescribed for Alzheimer's patients or is believed by some researchers to be promising as an Alzheimer's intervention. Now the overall claim is that rosemary contains many different aromatics, phytochemicals, compounds that have the ability to, number one, boost acetylcholine, suppress cholinesterase, reduce inflammation, boost various levels of this huperzine A, and various other things of this kind. Some researchers, like Dr. Duke, also believe that some of these chemicals have the ability of being absorbed through the skin, that is, transdermal. This opens the possibility of several different delivery mechanisms for things like rosemary. One of these, therefore, would be topical or for external use. That is to say, various lotions and even shampoos may be available that contain rosemary and may have the ability of sort of allowing the body to absorb some of the beneficial phytochemicals without having to swallow a pill or to do anything along the lines of that. However, other delivery mechanisms, for instance, internal delivery mechanisms, are available as well. Rosemary is available as an herb. You often find it on the kitchen spice rack. Many people add it into various dishes and can have access to it that way. Another possibility is rosemary tea. And then finally, a person might avail him or herself of various capsules or supplements from your local health food or nutrition store. But buying supplements, again, is only one route. As we said, that rosemary is an herb that is widely available as a kitchen spice. It is now more and more available in terms of lotions and shampoos, and those might be beneficial. Sometimes it is available as an aromatic to inhale it, and some people even opt to purchase the rosemary plant and to cultivate it themselves. Now, one interesting historical footnote. Rosemary is mentioned in various 17th century texts, Elizabethan English texts, for instance in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. In the play Hamlet, the character Ophelia remarks that rosemary is for remembrance. Now, there's a caveat. Obviously, the Shakespearean corpus is not generally regarded as a medical treatise. However, various pieces of literature along this line are sometimes contain elements of folk wisdom and other interesting facts. But we do know there's an interesting ambiguity in the word remembrance. Remembrance can mean memory or brain function, but remembrance can also mean commemoration, it can mean reminder, it could mean something like a souvenir. So in some treatments, for example, in a annotated version of Shakespeare's works, there is a footnote on that line from Dr. Ben Jonson, who compiled one of the earliest Shakespeare compendia. And Jonson remarks that he was unsure of why rosemary was selected for being an herb of remembrance. He notes that it is evergreen and that it is used in funerals, and this suggests perhaps the souvenir reading of the word remembrance. On the other hand, the 17th century English astrologer, botanist, and herbalist Nicholas Culpeper, in his very important The English Physician, published originally in London in 1652, Culpeper remarks that rosemary actually is regarded as an herb that is capable of boosting memory. There's some indication for various things for either interpretation. I only mention it because when you Google the herb rosemary, you're almost certain to encounter something along the lines of this. Once again, my perspective is something of an agnostic position. I am not saying that these herbs are going to be effective. I'm not saying that they're ineffective. For me, I suppose I take more of a guarded complementarian position and figure that if you're cooking anyway, you may as well sprinkle a little bit of rosemary into the dish. It might benefit you. Drink a little bit of rosemary tea. It's doubtful to me that there's going to be any adverse reaction to drinking rosemary tea. But once again, I'm not a physician. I am not a medical advisor. Consult your physician, your nutritionist for individual and personalized recommendations. If you found something of use in this video, I invite you to like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. Check back for further content. And I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you so much.